Afternoon. Uh, I'm going to talk about the business cycle. We've had business cycles for over 200 years, boom and bust cycles, and severe depressions. And so the question is, why have we let them continue? All right, so let's see if I can minimize this. Okay, so since economies have had periodic booms and busts, why do we let this happen? Why don't entrepreneurs, investors, and governments avoid depressions? What do you think? Well, Georg Hegel, a German philosopher, in his book, The Philosophy of History, said that nations and governments have never learned anything from history. So when there's a depression, they do change policies, but their policies are to treat the effects and the symptoms rather than eliminate the cause. So because the business cycle is generally misunderstood or not well understood, uh, nations and governments have not done anything to prevent the next one. All right, so to understand the business cycle, we have to start with the factors of production. Economists divide the inputs of production into three categories, which they call the factors of production. I think we're familiar with these if we've learned some economics. The factors are land, which includes all natural resources, labor, human exertion that seeks to create wealth, and capital goods, which are goods that have been produced but not yet consumed. Now, when we're increasing the stock of capital goods, economists call that investment. So an economic investment, an increase in the stock of capital goods, is different from a financial investment when you're buying stocks, bonds, and land. Any questions so far? Okay, so let me go back to screen share and we'll talk about capital goods. All right, so you'll see the slide that says the time structure of capital goods. So the time structure is the duration of capital goods, how long they last. So they rank from the goods at the bottom of the stack here are those with a high turnover and short duration. Sometimes it's called circulating capital. And at the top, such as real estate development, are capital goods with a long duration that they last a long time. It takes a long time to develop real estate. You have to buy land, you have to get permits, then you construct the buildings, and then you gradually sell them off. So at the top are capital goods with a long duration, at the bottom of capital goods, which with a short duration and quick turnover. So what determines how tall and short is this time structure of capital goods? What makes the structure taller and what makes it shorter? And the answer is the interest rate in the economy. So the structure of the capital goods, how tall or short is the stack, is determined by the rate of interest. Low interest rates make the stack taller. Why? Because when you're investing your funds, making a financial investment, you could either buy bonds that pay interest, or you can invest in capital goods in which the growth of the capital goods in the company would give you the return. So low interest rates make the stack taller, right? Because the growth of capital goods is greater than the interest rate of bonds. Think of a tree. If you want to invest in a tree that matures in 50 years, whether you will buy the tree or invest in bonds depends on the growth of the rate of growth of the tree. Will the tree give you a higher or lower return than bonds? So if bonds have a low interest rate and the tree is growing faster than that, you'll invest in the trees. High interest rates then make the stack shorter because people would rather buy bonds than invest in the capital goods if bonds pay more than capital goods. And so where does the interest rate come from? Why is the interest rate positive rather than zero? And the answer to that is it's called time preference. And time preference is the tendency of most people, most of the time, to prefer goods in the present day to goods in the future. So why does that happen? Why do people tend to have a time preference? The two reasons. One is uh, life is short. We have a finite lifespan, and the uncertainty of the future. We don't know what our situation will be 20, 30 years from now. And so people tend to prefer to have goods sooner rather than later. And that creates a discount. Goods that you have to wait for to buy them later have a lower value at the present day than goods which you can have right away. Right. So the rate at which future goods become discounted, less and less value as you go into the future, becomes the natural free market interest rate. And the Swedish economist Knut Wicksell called this the natural rate of interest. Right, so the role of interest is important in the economy. The interest rate has important jobs in the economy. It's not simply what you get from savings or what you pay for borrowing. There are three jobs that the interest rate has to do. One is to equalize borrowings and savings so that the amount saved equals the amount borrowed. And when it's doing that, it also equalizes savings and economic investment. If we net out borrowing for consumption, the rest of savings is loaned for investment. And third, when it's doing those things, it is allocating spending between consumption and investment. Economists generally say there's two basic things you can do with your income. You can spend it for consumption or you can spend it for investment. And the interest rate allocates how much goes to consumption or investment. If more people want to save, the interest rate goes down and there's less consumption and more investment. So the allocation between consumption and investment depends on the interest rate. And if the interest rate is set by the market, then everything is in harmony. If there's more savings, there's less consumption, right? If there's more savings, the interest rate is lower and there's more borrowing. So here we see a graph of the market for loanable funds. Loanable funds are funds available to loan out for people to borrow, right? And the supply of loanable funds comes from savings as well as the creation of credit by the financial system, by banks. So that's supply. The demand for loanable funds is the demand to borrow, right? And where the supply and demand intersect, just like for goods, where they intersect, that creates the market rate of interest. Let me stop share here. And does anybody have any questions so far? Okay, I'll go back to share the screen. So you should now see once again the slide, the market for loanable funds. Now I'll go to the next slide. All right, so when I say the rate of interest, I'm talking about pure interest. You know, when you have a credit card debt and you have something like, 15% rate of payment, they call that interest, but most of it is not interest. Most of what is called interest is non-interest debt service. For example, the lender has to pay taxes on interest income. Inflation can make the nominal rate higher. And some of what you're paying when you're paying so-called interest is a compensation for risk. because lenders have bad loans. And then lenders have overhead and normal profit. So pure interest is what is paid to shift a purchase from the future to the present day, aside from these non-time elements. All right, so all is well as long as the interest rate is set by the market. But nowadays, and for the past 100 years and longer than that, uh, the interest rate has been distorted through manipulations by a central bank. When the Federal Reserve, for example, uh, buys and sells bonds, right? They do that to manipulate the interest rate. If they want the interest rate to be lower, right, they create more money. There's more money to loan out, and the interest rates fall. If they want to raise the interest rate, right, they reduce the money supply, and the banks are able to increase their interest rate because uh, because of the demand. So manipulations by a central bank prevent the interest rate from doing its job. Remember the three jobs: equalizing savings and borrowing, equalizing savings and investment, allocating income between consumption and investment. The interest rate is not able to do its job well if the interest rate is not set by the market, but is manipulated by the central bank. The central bank, when it pushes down the interest rate, creates unsustainable and wasted economic investment. At the low rate of interest, it's cheap to borrow. That's cheap credit. So people borrow, right? But the investments and projects become unsustainable when interest rates go back up. Projects that were profitable at low interest rates are no longer profitable at higher interest rates. So this is what happened, for example, after 2001, when the Federal Reserve pushed interest rates down to like 1% for interbank loans. So there was a large increase in real estate investment, but it was unsustainable when interest rates went back up in 2007, right? These projects stopped, construction stopped, and the result was a recession. So the result of these manipulations are bad effects like inflation and recession. So when the central bank expands the money, the interest rate is pushed below its natural rate. The credit expansion fuels a boom, especially in the purchase and construction of real estate. Remember, that was high on the stack of capital goods. Real estate construction and ownership is very sensitive to the interest rates. When people buy a house, for example, what do they look at most of all? How much will I pay per month? And today, interest rates are extremely low, so the monthly rate is low. And so therefore, real estate prices have held up in spite of all the uh, effects of the depression of the past year. So when there's excessive expansion of money, the manipulated interest rate falls. There's more investment in the long-lasting capital goods, especially real estate construction, and they turn out to be bad investments. Economists call these malinvestments, right? So the problem is not just inflation when you have an increase in the money supply, but a change in relative prices, a wasteful distortion of relative prices. For example, the ratio of real estate rentals to real estate purchase prices. So when there's inflation um, and interest rates are low and there's a lot of purchasing, the ratio gets out of whack, right? House prices go up faster than house rentals. That's what happens. So here's an illustration of the boom bust cycle. It's like a sine wave, a stylized version. Of course, real cycles aren't that smooth, but that just shows you the various aspects. So let me go back to stop share to the gallery. let's see. Oh, my picture went out. There it is. So can somebody tell me the difference between a recession and a depression? Right. Well, let's go back to the share screen.
I have a definition.
Yeah. Go ahead.
A recession is when the other guy loses his job. A depression is when you lose your job.
Okay. That's a comical definition. But if you look at, you all see the screen that says boom bust cycle with the graph. The the recession is related to the word recede, which means to fall back. So a recession is when total output is falling. So if you look at the peak of the cycle on the left, at the peak, and then you look at the bottom part of the cycle on the right, where it has number 1, right? The peak is number 5. From the peak to the bottom is when output is falling, and that is what a recession is, falling output. So all the way down, it's a recession. A depression is when the economy is depressed relative to its long run rate. And so if you on the right side, if you look at phase 4 and phase 1, the economy is depressed. It's below the growth potential, that horizontal line, right? So that's what a depression is. When the economy is depressed, it's below its long-term amount. So sometimes people say recession when they're really talking about a depression, because at the bottom in phase 1, the economy is still depressed, but now output is rising and the recession is over. Oops. All right, so real estate is the major player. What drives the boom bust cycle is changes in economic investment. When investment is rising, the rest of the economy follows. When investment is falling, the rest of the economy drops also. And so remember, investment, we're talking about economic investment, not financial investment. Investment in capital goods and perhaps education. So the major portion of economic investment is real estate construction. So when you build real estate, right, you're not just paying the people in construction, you need the materials, wood, bricks, cement, right? And after you've built a house, you need durable goods, furniture, stove, refrigerator, other appliances. So there's a lot of capital goods associated with real estate, right? So about a third of all investment is in related to real estate. And now remember, artificially low interest rates induce a construction boom. The low rates also create land speculation, right? Since economists call bad investments malinvestments, I'm calling uh, speculation mal-speculation because it turns out to be harmful to the economy. So when people borrow to buy or construct real estate, right, they're buying land as well as the building. And so, and what goes up during the cycle is not the value of the building, which is based on the cost of construction, but the value of the land. So land values. So at first, when the economy is recovering from a depression, at first you're filling vacancies, and then rental values go up, and then land values go up because of the greater demand for land. But then speculators see real estate prices go up, and they buy real estate waiting for the price to go up even higher. So land values rise beyond that which is affordable for people that want to buy housing and businesses that want to invest in more space and buildings. Land values rise beyond the point at which enterprises can make a profit after paying for rent or mortgages. And the most optimistic speculators are the ones who buy at the peak, and they get what's called a winner's curse, right? The curse of having paid too much and losing money. Now, there's another thing that made the real estate cycle that much worse, especially up until the Depression of 2008, and that is the institutions which are popularly called Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. That's not their official names, but these are government-sponsored enterprises, and what their job is to create a secondary market in mortgages. The originator of a mortgage is where you first get your loan. Let's say you're buying a house and you go to a bank and you get a mortgage loan from the bank. The bank can then sell that loan to in the secondary market to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, government-sponsored enterprises. Now, Fannie Mae was started by the government, the federal government. Then it becomes semi-privatized in that you can buy bonds uh, for Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, and so they have owners, nominally private owners, but there was always a implicit government guarantee that if Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac got into trouble, they would be bailed out by the federal government. And that implicit guarantee became explicit uh, in the recession of 2008 when they had a lot of bad loans and the federal government stepped in to bail them out. So they're in effect government guaranteed. So the fact that a bank can make a mortgage and then sell it to Fannie Mae and get money for it and then sell another mortgage, right? This accelerated the purchase of real estate. So it's another subsidy to real estate. Um, and there were real estate derivatives called mortgage-backed securities. So what Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac did, or still do, is they package mortgages. Let's say they collect 100 mortgages from various parts of the country, package it into one security, which is called a mortgage-backed security. So that would be a derivative derived from the mortgage, but becomes its own security, and then that is then sold in the market. So Fannie and Freddie accelerated the rise in real estate up until 2008. All right, so um, when government spends money on public goods like highways, security, parks, schools, and so on, when government provides public works, right, then to the extent that they're beneficial, they generate land rent, right? And that land rent is then capitalized into the price of land. So much of the value of land comes from public works and services paid for mostly by taxes on labor and capital goods. So workers pay income tax, people pay sales tax when they buy goods. That finances government, and then government provides public goods that generates higher land rent, right? This was noted by Adam Smith, the economist of the 1700s, in his book, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. Adam Smith noted that every improvement in the circumstances of society tends to either directly or indirectly raise the real rent of land to increase the wealth of the landlord. And so I call this the mother of all interventions, because uh, the land value created by public good dwarfs all the other subsidies that government provides. So little of that value is paid from property taxes, specifically on land. So these public goods get capitalized as higher land value and more rent. Here's a graph of the real estate boom up till 2004. You can see that there was an increase in the value of real estate in the 1970s when there was high inflation. Then you had a recession in 1980. Then you had the the boom of the 1980s, followed by a recession in 1990. And after that, you had a boom. So the red lines is the annual increase in the value of real estate. The green lines that are smaller are the annual increase in national income. You can see that the value of real estate was growing a lot faster than national income. So here's a chart of the real estate cycle of the United States from the early 1800s. All right, so the first column on the left is the peak in land value. So you can see in the there was a peak in 1818. There was a peak in 1836. The the real estate prices rose in the north and the east uh, during the 1830s because of canal building. So the big public works project of the 1830s was the building of canals. Everybody knew that land along the canal was going to go up in value. So the speculators jumped in and they increased these property values to an unsustainable height, followed by a recession and depression of 1837, sometimes called the Panic of 1837. Then the economy recovered, and then there was another peak in 1954, another peak in 1872, 1890. Notice these intervals of land value was 18 years, right? So this created an 18-year real estate boom and bust cycle. Why was it so close to 18 years? Well, it's a long cycle because it takes several years for real estate to recover from the depression. It takes several years for vacancies to disappear, several years for land rentals to go up, and then land values go up, and then you get speculation. But why exactly 18 years? I don't know. I think it's mostly a coincidence. Other people think it's got to be more than that, right? But I'm just taking it as the historical record of 18 years. So notice that in the 1920s, there was a big real estate boom. It peaked out in 1925. There was an especially big boom in Florida real estate, which also peaked out in 1925. It plateaued until the beginning of the Depression that started in 1929. Um, but then notice that the next peak occurred in 1973. The next peak would have been in the 1940s if the 18-year pattern had continued. But the severity of the Great Depression and World War II, when they were building barracks instead of houses, right, eliminated the real estate cycle. So it's not an absolute something that has to happen. It can be changed if there's major world events like a World War I, like a World War, as in the 1940s. But then the real estate cycle came back in the 1950s, and then we see the peak in 1973. Now, the next peak was 1979, only 6 years later. So why was that? Because of the high inflation. There was very high inflation during the 1970s. And so anything tangible was going up, not just real estate. Gold and silver went way up. I mean, silver went from $5 an ounce to $50 an ounce. Gold went up from 250 to 850, right? So there were huge increases, anything tangible, including real estate. So property values peaked in 1979, and then you had a real recovery. So there was no real economic recovery in the 1970s. They called it stagflation as the economy stagnated with high unemployment, yet there was inflation. All right, so there was a recession in 1980, then there was a real recovery, and land values next peaked in 1989, followed by the recession of 1990, and then you had peak in land values in 2005, and then the recession, and also construction, and the recessions that started in late 2007 or around 2008, mostly, right? And so I have a question mark. If it were not for the COVID pandemic, you probably would have seen a peak. The next peak in land values would have been around 2022, and the next recession would have been around 2026. Let me see if there's a, I think there's a question. Is there, oh, no, I guess, okay, oops, yeah. So some uh, economists like Fred Harrison in the UK or uh, Anderson in Australia believe the 18-year cycle is still intact and we will still see a depression in 2026. I think the pandemic has restructured real estate where you see falls in the rentals in places like San Francisco, but housing prices have held up in most places because of the extremely low interest rates. So I think the cycle has been interrupted. Other people disagree. Here's the Japanese boom and bust, very similar to that of the US and other countries. You saw a boom in the 1980s, accompanied by a real estate speculation. Land values peaked out around 1991. And after that, you had a decline. And you had a stock market boom on top of the real estate boom. So you had a fall in stock market prices in Japan also. So what is it that causes the recession? What ends the boom? It's high prices, right? Where people that want to live, investors, including businesses and households, can no longer afford real estate because of high interest rates having gone back up, and high prices for real estate. And that chokes out off new investment. Businesses can't expand anymore because real estate is too costly, both in terms of interest rates and the price of real estate. So they stop, investment slows down, and investment drives the business cycle. When investment falls, the rest of the economy follows. So you have the malinvestment crash, the unsustainable bad investments, the malinvestments slow down and stop. And the collapse of economic investment causes the rest of the economy to plunge. Workers in construction and other real estate fields lose their jobs. And when real estate construction stops, then the raw materials, the demand for the raw materials stop, and the demand for consumer durables or office furniture drops. So a lot of other investment also falls with it. So then loans default as businesses go bankrupt because their revenues have fallen. Loans default, banks fail, the financial system crashes, and there's a big credit constraint. So people that look at the uh, recession, say in 2008 and the depression of 2008, they often just focus on the financial sector, what's happening with the banks and insurance companies, whereas the underlying more basic cause is the real estate cycle. So we get the financial waterfall as we saw in 2008 when you had all kinds of firms going bankrupt, insurance companies like AIG, brokerage firms like Merrill Lynch, construction companies. So that's the financial waterfall. And so the fiscal and monetary remedy for depressions is to stop the subsidy to real estate. The elimination of the business cycle requires the elimination of the real estate boom bust cycle. And the elimination of the real estate cycle requires the elimination of the rent subsidy to landowners, the implicit rent subsidy from public goods, as well as the monetary subsidy of cheap credit. So there's a fiscal subsidy, the generation of rent from public goods, and the interest rate subsidy of low mortgage rates. as we have today. So what's the fiscal remedy? The fiscal means government spending and revenues. So the fiscal revenue is to eliminate the subsidy. So the public goods provided by government, they generate land rent. The collection of this rent by government would prevent the subsidy to landowners, and that would eliminate land speculation. The price of land, when it's taxed, falls to a small amount of the non-tax price, and that removes the gains from excessive land speculation. So tapping the land value also has no excess burden, as I think most of you are aware. If you tax goods or labor or business profits or buildings, there's a deadweight loss, a reduction in the supply of those products, and an increase in the cost to buy them. And that's a deadweight loss. It's a loss of economic value to consumers and producers. Whereas if you tap land value for public revenue, there's no excess burden because you can tax land and it does not flee, shrink, or hide when it's taxed. If you tax other things, they shrink, there's less of it, they flee, they go someplace else, or they hide because they don't want to be taxed. But land can't do that. So tapping land value has no excess burden. And on the financial side, to completely prevent the boom bust sequence, we have to fix the interest rate side also. So one remedy for credit manipulation is, instead of the central bank manipulating the interest rate to provide cheap credit when the economy is depressed, right? Let the market set the rate of interest. So that's called free market money in banking, is when the money supply and the interest rate is set by the market instead of being manipulated by the government. Just as government does not know the best price for apples or cars, those are best determined by the market. Government cannot wisely tell us what the best rate of interest is. Now, of course, it can set a rate of interest, but then you later have distortions such as inflation or recessions. So you would have free banking with competitive private banknotes. And that would provide both flexibility and stability. You would have real money. In the old days before the Great Depression, the real money was gold, and the banks printed their own banknotes. Well, in free banking, uh, as they did, for example, in Scotland, the banks printed their own banknotes convertible into gold. But the fact that these banknotes, as well as bank deposits, uh, was expandable, you could have more when there was a greater demand for the money. It provided flexibility as well as price stability. So if you're interested in free banking, a good book on it is a book by George Selgin, The Theory of Free Banking. It's available in the internet. And then when you have market-based money supply and banking, then the natural rate of interest prevails. You no longer have the interest rate subsidy as we have had with central banking. So as Hegel stated, governments are not learning from theory or history. The basic structure of government intervention and taxing goods instead of land is unchanged. So we're now in an economic crisis. The recovery depends on fiscal policy. And so in my judgment, government should compensate for the loss of income from small businesses, such as stores and restaurants. Uh, they should compensate for the loss and avoid imposing costs on the recovery. Right? Taxing labor, goods, right, buildings imposes costs on the recovery. So to avoid that, tax land instead. So the coming crisis of the 2020s, chronic deficits will be covered by borrowing until the next Great Recession. Government more deeply in debt will no longer be able to borrow to bail out the financial and real estate sectors. The government debt has tremendously expanded, and right now the government has good credit, right? But that won't last forever. Uh, so if there's another crisis, not like today's, which is caused by shutdowns and lockdowns, but one caused by the normal business cycle, you could have an economic catastrophe of another Great Depression with government no longer able to borrow money. A good example of economic recovery is the San Francisco example in 1906. As you know, there was a big earthquake and fire in 1906. And so with the buildings destroyed, right, what was the remaining value was land value in San Francisco. Now, back in 1906, there were no taxes on income. This was before the income tax, and there wasn't even a sales tax either. California did not get a sales tax until the 1930s. So in effect, the property tax was land value taxation. And so you own property in San Francisco, you could either build back or pay the property tax without getting any benefit from the building, from the property. And so people had a big incentive to rebuild and rebuild quickly. And so uh, property owners rebuilt quickly, and in a couple of years, San Francisco was back. So the same thing could be done today when the lockdowns end. So we could eliminate depressions. If we implement the public collection of rent, that is land value taxation, and there are no imposed costs and no subsidies, we can uh, we can have an economy that does not have a boom and bust. So stop the fiscal and monetary subsidy to investment and land value, and the business cycle will go away. There will be no more boom and bust.